The impeachment inquiry into President Biden began today, led by GOP Chair James Comer and the House Oversight Committee. And yet, for me, the question remains, exactly what is the evidence that took us to the point of an impeachment inquiry? Not Hunter Biden or James Biden's businesses, or what Joe Biden might have, could have, should have known about shady but likely legal businesses. What exactly are the high crimes and misdemeanors that have brought us to this point? This is the argument that was made by lead GOP witness Jonathan Turley.
And I want to emphasize what it is that we're here today for. This is a question of an impeachment inquiry. It is not a vote on articles of impeachment. In fact, I do not believe that the current evidence would support articles of impeachment. That is something that an inquiry has to establish. But I also do believe that the House has passed the threshold for an impeachment inquiry. First, President Biden has indeed spoken falsely about these foreign deals. Second, President Biden was the focus of a multi-million-dollar influence peddling scheme. And then finally, President Biden may have benefited from millions of dollars as a part of that scheme. Now, those facts should not be taken out of context. They're merely allegations, and they should not become presumptions of impeachable conduct.
Now, let's put his comments in context. I think he's right that President Biden has spoken falsely about whether he ever talked to Hunter about his businesses. But then he says that President Biden was the focus of a multi-million-dollar influence peddling scheme. That seems to be true. Every president is the focus of multi-million-dollar influence peddling schemes. They're called lobbyists. And finally, he says that President Biden may have benefited. Well, that's not enough. There is no evidence that he benefited. But because anything is possible, that's not enough. Many people forget that back in 2020, a guy named Tony Bobulinski, who worked with Hunter Biden, claimed that 10% of the equity in a multi-million-dollar deal with a Chinese energy company went to the big guy, a.k.a. Joe Biden. Now, number one, Biden wasn't even vice president then, so he'd be allowed to pursue businesses. But more importantly, there is no indication that Biden got a penny of the money. How do we know? The Wall Street Journal got all of Bobulinski's material and documents, Wall Street Journal, not a liberal publication, and determined, quote, the venture set up in 2017 after Mr. Biden left the vice presidency and before his presidential campaign never received proposed funds from the Chinese company or completed any deals. According to people familiar with the matter, corporate records reviewed by the Wall Street Journal show no role for Joe Biden. What we got at the hearing today was basically a rehash of the influence peddling allegations against Hunter Biden, his uncle James Biden, without anything concrete tying Joe Biden to the businesses. Now remember, everything went into overdrive after the recent testimony of Hunter Biden's friend and former business partner Devon Archer, who was on the board of the Ukrainian company Burisma with Hunter. Testimony which I think, by the way, was credible. And it seems to support two things. One is good for the former vice president, current president. One is not so good. Number one, it sure seems then Vice President Biden did talk to his son in some ways about his businesses, even though he's repeatedly denied doing so. But number two, there's still no credible evidence of any corruption by Joe Biden or even any direct involvement in any of Hunter's businesses. Archer testified that Hunter put his father on speakerphone during business meetings and that those conversations would entail, quote, where are you? How's the weather? How's the fishing? How's the whatever it may be? Yet, it was very, casual conversations about, not about cap tables or financials or anything like that. Yes, it's clear Hunter was selling his supposed access and selling his name. That is influence peddling, and it was effective for Hunter. This was Devon Archer with Tucker Carlson.
I could definitively say at particular dinners or meetings, he knew there were business associates. To be, completely clear on the calls, I don't know if it was an orchestrated call in or not. It certainly was powerful, though, because if you're sitting with a foreign business person and you hear the vice president's voice, that's prize enough. I mean, that's pretty impactful stuff for anyone.
Fair enough. But here's the most important question that Archer was asked about during his closed-door testimony. Did you have any knowledge of Joe Biden having any involvement with Burisma? Archer replied, no, not direct, no. But yes, it does seem President Biden was not being forthcoming when he has repeatedly said this.
How many times have you ever spoken to your son about his overseas business dealings?
I've never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings. I have never discussed with my son or my brother or anyone else anything having to do with their businesses.
Do you stand by your statement that you did not discuss any of your son's overseas business dealings with him?
Yes, I stand by that.
Now, initially it seemed this was how the Oversight Committee hoped to bring down President Biden, by saying he lied about that. But it appears that they realized a potential lie to the public or the media isn't nearly enough for an impeachment inquiry, and it's not a standard that any president can live by. So now they've seemingly moved the goalposts, and it starts to sound like they're suggesting that if Hunter was trying to sell the Biden name and he got Joe Biden on the phone and got him to join some dinners, that should be enough to show corruption on the part of his dad. This comes after the much-hyped FBI form alleging a bribe to Joe Biden, which appears to have fizzled. This was a so-called 1023 form where we learned that Mykola Zlochevsky, the CEO of Burisma, the Ukrainian energy company, where Hunter Biden served as a consultant for 5 years, the same firm, by the way, Devon Archer served on the board, apparently told an FBI source that he'd essentially been shaken down by both Hunter and Joe Biden to the tune of $10 million. Quote, it cost $5 million to pay one Biden and $5 million to pay another Biden. And the confidential source told the FBI that Zlochevsky claimed to have many text messages and recordings that show that he was coerced to make such payments. Now, when that came out, I thought that's a big deal, right? I mean, if this guy actually has text messages and other proof, well, this could be devastating. Except then even the most anti-Biden investigators started backing away from that, including James Comer.
That's what this person says. But again, take that with a grain of salt. I'm not aware that we have verified that those recordings exist.
I can confirm they were listed in the 1023 that the FBI redacted. We don't know if they're legit or not, but we know that the foreign national claims he has them.
Right, and there's no evidence of those existing. And again, the alleged motivation for the payouts is important, right? The source told the FBI informant it was to ensure the firing of a Ukrainian prosecutor, the top prosecutor, named Viktor Shokin, who'd supposedly been investigating Burisma. The idea being firing of Shokin would more or less shut down the investigation into Burisma. And Shokin has recently claimed Hunter Biden was brought on by Burisma to protect from criminal investigations, and that by Vice President Biden threatening to withhold $1 billion in U.S. loan guarantees from Ukraine unless Shokin was fired, that was a bribe. Of course, Shokin has changed his story numerous times, and he was the person who was ousted and accused of being corrupt, so obviously he's not happy about it. But most importantly, as we talked about before, ousting Shokin was not a Biden-alone decision. Then Vice President Biden had the support of the international community and President Obama and even Senate Republicans to oust Shokin. Not because he was a crusader who was trying to shut down corruption in Ukraine, but for the exact opposite reason. He was allowing corruption to thrive, and corruption was a very sensitive issue in Ukraine at this time. The people there had been ripped off 5 years earlier to the tune of billions of dollars. And this included Burisma. Right? Remember where Devon Archer testified that Burisma viewed Viktor Shokin as an ally, not as a threat. And if Biden is taking secret bribes to do it, is it really credible that he's out there bragging about it? It doesn't make any sense.
I think it was, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
Look, I've said this before. Hunter Biden has done his dad no favors by using his name to get a lucrative position for a potentially corrupt company like Burisma, while his dad was tasked with cleaning up corruption in the same country. At the least, it looks really bad. Just hiring Hunter Biden, of course, seems like an effort to impact U.S.-Ukraine policy. But as of now, there are no tapes, there are no texts, there's no credibility to the claim made by Zlochevsky. By the way, apparently he made it after meeting with Rudy Giuliani during his trip to dig up dirt on Biden in 2019. In fact, Zlochevsky himself has apparently also denied ever speaking to the Bidens in a conversation with an associate of Rudy Giuliani. A transcript surfaced during Trump's first impeachment. Zlochevsky saying, quote, "No one from Burisma ever had any contacts with VP Biden or people working for him during Hunter Biden's engagement." So it's not just unverified allegations that are seemingly lacking in credibility. These are actually allegations that the DOJ during the Trump administration examined and either ignored or dismissed. What about the text message that Hunter supposedly sent to a Chinese business associate? Quote, "I'm sitting here with my father, and we'd like to understand why the commitment made has not been fulfilled." Look, Hunter's lawyers claim the text isn't real, but let's assume it is. First, you have to believe Hunter, right? You have to believe Hunter that his dad is sitting with him. But again, Joe Biden wasn't in government or running for office at the time, but most importantly, there's nothing to suggest Joe Biden was there. What about the IRS whistleblowers, claiming they weren't allowed to pursue this lead because they alleged the investigation into Hunter was stymied by political bias within the DOJ? Putting aside that others have refuted that, Biden wasn't president when the information came in. Trump was. Trump-appointed Attorney General Bill Barr was the one who either ignored or rejected it. But Chairman Comer has made it clear he's going to treat the Biden family members as if they are Joe Biden, regardless of what the evidence does or doesn't show. And now they're asking, for example, why during his time as vice president, Joe Biden used a pseudonym in emails, documents, other communications. This is a widespread practice among several administrations. Bill Barr did it himself, by the way. Look, if there is actual evidence that Biden did more than potentially lie about knowing more about his son's businesses than he claimed, if there is proof showing Joe Biden actually orchestrating his son's influence peddling, or that he himself was influenced by large payouts to his family members, and that influenced U.S. policymaking, or that he was on the take for any of it, I will be the first one to call this out and talk about the need to take action. Even though he was vice president at the time, I think that would be a valid reason to impeach him now. But an impeachment inquiry cannot, should not, just be an effort to dig up dirt. It's too serious. Now, after months of investigations, we're into an impeachment proceeding with nothing more than he supposedly lied and I have questions. And it seems there is no evidence of high crimes or misdemeanors that would bring us to this point. Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your cable provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.